Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our inaugural set of podcasts from the Australian Curriculum Studies Association, also known as ACSA. We are an organisation, as you probably know, that sets to provide that national voice on curriculum matters and looks at the pedagogical approaches and conversations that are happening all across Australia and the world today. Now, this first set of podcasts has been a really exciting journey because we get to talk to our board members about their experiences and all of their achievements over their educational journeys so far. But first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters of which we choose to learn, to live and to work. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their contributions to the educational landscape today and their continued work to help support all of the learning across Australia. Now, it gives me great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Helen Schiele to ACSA Insights. Now, as a board member, she plays a vital role in the perspectives of the early years space. She has got extensive experiences with those really key developmental understandings of the very important first few years of a student's educational journey. She is the Director of Pedagogical Pathways, which is an organisation that supports educators in the areas of leadership, curriculum frameworks, assessments and moderations. Now, she's also a certified cognitive coach and held positions on several educational boards. So we're delighted to welcome Helen.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
We kind of know, especially in the early years space, that sometimes when a firefighter, a nurse, some kind of profession has been introduced to even the youngest of our students, that has a really significant impact on them. And we'll often hear the conversation of, I want to now be a doctor or a firefighter. And that motivation, I think we can never underestimate how early that begins for so many students. But I suppose I'd like to ask you, Helen, when did your motivation and kind of desire to go into education begin?
Probably when I was a teenager. My mother was a director of an early learning centre, and I would go in after school and help out with the children in that space. So it was from birth to 5 years, and it really got me thinking about the importance of education, and especially in the early years space, how incredible an educational setting is to the journey of the child, and especially in those formative years, because we know birth to 8 is the most critical learning journey of the child in that space. So for me, it really started then and really inspired me to go on and do my degrees in early childhood education and primary education.
Yeah. And I think that's a really key point, isn't it? Because those, as you're saying, those few years are so vital and such a huge amount happens developmentally for a young child. And so having specialists, our teachers who are specialists in that area is so key to being able to support the longer educational journey. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when I look back over your bio and I was doing my little research on you, you've had a really vast career and done lots of work, and most especially obviously in Victoria, but also on that national framework stage. If you were to look back over it so far, what are some of the greatest achievements you think you've had?
I think being a critical friend for the Australian curriculum, especially in the foundation area, was really important work that I did with ACARA, and introducing the language of play in the foundation classroom and having that notion of play being a learning conduit for the child and seeing it as the most important work of the child during the day and what play can facilitate and how it really engages the child, and through provocations offered to the child, it stimulates their creativity and their critical and creative thinking. So doing that work was really important, and having that language for teachers to be confident to use play and to safely use play in the classroom as an educational model and a form of pedagogy was really critical in that development of the foundation classroom. So I'd have to say that work was really very exciting to engage in as a critical friend with ACARA.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love that concept of play. I remember doing a bit of work with Dr. Sandra Hesterman over here in WA when we there was a launch of Play WA, and it sort of sat with me because sitting in my STEM space, I found that I think it's that element where when you look at young children who are completely immersed in what they're doing, and it is all encompassing, and you see the determination they have. And it seems that with then having, and you see that in STEM when you give them these projects, but then it seems as they go through their journey, that intensity or that kind of the real pushing into something and even the mindfulness associated with play has to sort of be retaught again. It's like if we could just foster that so that we kind of don't take that away and then have to re-put it back in, it would be much more success, I think. Now, I suppose this is always quite a difficult one. We've had a few of these ones because we're trying very much to teach young people and students the power of self-reflection. And in order to improve, you have to self-reflect and see and look at it and approach it in maybe in a different way. Is there something that you would say, if I was to look back, I might have approached that a bit differently because I might have wanted the same outcome and got there in an easier way, or I looked for a different outcome probably in the long term?
I think my work in the classroom and developing my own practice and being able to articulate what my practice was really important for me, being self-reflective, and really looking at the principles of practice and what does that mean when we think about the Victorian early years developmental framework, but also the early years framework and what does that look like. And being the reflective practitioner, I don't think as teachers we engage in that space enough or really authentically in that space. So being accountable to the reflection and saying, how did I engage in that learning opportunity with the child? Was that a provocation that awakened the creativity for the child? Are we giving them the opportunity to go back and relaunch the provocations so they're getting a different concept of understanding and embedding it in that way? So I think for me, being a reflective practitioner and really engaging in that space was quite pivotal in my formative years in the classroom. So I think looking at modes of development in how to be reflective, I don't think I probably did exceptionally well back in my early days, but now looking back on my own practice now and working with teams of teachers and giving them the permission to engage in reflection is really important for their pedagogy of practice.
100%. And I think, that's when you say that, I get that sense that, when you say working as a team, and that is something lovely because it's when a team trusts one another, we see the best results. And, if they feel that you are their best interests are invested, then that makes a huge difference. And you're so right. Yeah, I was just thinking about something I remember with early, even just doing a bit of early childhood work when I was there, was that question of why, which we ask children so much. Oh, why did you do it that way? And it's such a huge concept because you often will get the answer because I wanted to, or because I just did. And it's even those elements. I mean, I have to self-reflect and go, how do I pose and structure a question to a little child that will help support their learning rather than just ask them why, and thinking that that would be a self-reflection tool, so what's happening here that is making that not work, those sort of things. So that power of language is really important. Now this one is actually, I was very excited to have this question today, especially with you, Helen, because when we think of the early years, what I love about the early years space is that the majority of early years teachers, and it's probably from opinion I see, they really engage in pedagogical approaches outside of Australia as well. We talk about Montessori ways, or we talk in the play-based learning, say in Finland and Sweden, and then also the Reggio Emilia approach. A lot of early childhood specialists have got a real depth of pedagogical knowledge which extends beyond, because it's so linked to the developmental age of the children, and they understand it also because so much intervention happens from other professionals. But we've got psychologists come in, and we've got the whole different that very holistic approach. So I suppose my question with you is, what do you see as the kind of the concept of curriculum?
It's really fascinating. I mean, I go back to my time I spent in Reggio Emilia, and I had the privilege of, being immersed in the curriculum there and what it offers, and really understanding what Reggio Emilia inspired is. We can't be Reggio here in the pure form because we're not based in the municipality of Reggio, but being inspired by the the curriculum that it offers and how it engages the child. So for me, curriculum is a living, breathing set of artifacts that we use for achievement standards and content descriptors that welcomes the child into a very safe and culturally responsive curriculum, which I think is critical these days, to have a safe learning environment, but invites the child to engage with materials and performance products. I think is really critical, because it's that learning outcome. What is the end product going to look like, and what does the success criteria look like? And I think when we look at the curriculum of a Reggio-inspired space, it's saying, how do we relaunch? How do we go back to the child and offer that provocation so they engage with it at a different level? And it's the same with the Australian and Victorian curriculums that I work with predominantly here in Victoria. It's looking at those spaces and using the general capabilities to really stimulate the child and saying, you know, what is it that's enabling us to be that critical and creative thinker, that I'm in that personal and social capability, but then also using the cross-curriculum priorities as a way to stimulate and further engage, to deepen that creativity. So for me, you know, the curriculum is a living, breathing document that really welcomes the child for lifelong learning.
Yeah, and that's just music to my ears. I think, Helen, that you know, some of those concepts you just discussed, because I think sometimes early years become the victim of, because everyone thinks early intervention is key, but they often get thrown so many even like commercialized products or guaranteed ways of success, and having to adopt them in the early years often get that pressure so much more so than other areas, because it's like, well, if we start this program earlier, we're going to have greater success, and not really understanding the developmental ages of students, and also that really key thing of like, sometimes what happens today will not have any effect until many years down the line, but it's about those building the foundational stages, whereas we often get so caught up in going on that trajectory of seeing improvement, when actually sometimes those foundations take much longer than we think they should, isn't it? And I suppose that's a really important part. There's obviously, we're constantly bombarded with, especially in the media, and it's hard to kind of, I suppose, in the world of AI and everything, kind of put aside the reliability and accountability of claims that are made. But what do you think, for us as a profession, are some of the biggest challenges we're facing today?
I think teacher retention is critical. We have a workforce that is exhausted. We have a issue, especially here in Victoria, because we're moving to 30 hours off 4-year-old kindergarten. So we're looking for something close to 8,500 new kindergarten teachers. So trying to engage in that space and bring teachers on board to engage with the early years. So, you know, quite often we have tertiary education offering a dual stream of early childhood primary, and staff will turn around and go into the primary. But it's saying, you know, let's really engage with the early years and look at how to give importance to those first 1,000 days, which start in the womb, and saying, you know, this is where the real education sits. You know, I'm banging on my soapbox here.
100%.
Passionate about the early years. So really teacher retention and keeping teachers in the workforce and engaged with it, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, and just working with curriculum in a dynamic way, that it becomes a collective process of team moderation and having those stimulating conversations to say, what are the artifacts that the children are creating and what does success look like for them, and being really clear on what the outcome is for the child. So I think, you know, really engaging in a collective way with teachers is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing, especially when we look at our rural and regional areas, that loneliness and that sense of sometimes, you know, especially for our graduates, going out to some of those places where you are the only one. And as you're saying, in those early years space, it's really, really important, because you really need a holistic approach to surround. And often you're in with people who've not done that early years training. So it's about having your own self-confidence. So, and we actually discussed, I think yesterday that came up a few times, is that power of a network, being able to
Yes.
connect with others. And, we look at, we obviously the board, the level of conversation, even just about AXA and the memberships and who are people turning to, whereas we've got these rich associations where the knowledge and framework is really well documented. It's data informed and evidence based, and it's, I suppose, getting our teachers to connect with them and seeing the power that you have as a collective together to work towards those goals. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. So just talking about that with sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say, and the importance of having a really good mentor,
Yes,
especially in those first few years as a graduate teacher, I think is really critical. Here in Victoria, with the Victorian Institute of Teaching, we've got a registration process where they've got to curate a set of documents and artefacts that go through for registration to say, this is my research project, and it's about 6 weeks in length. And having that mentor to walk alongside the graduate teacher in that space to be able to articulate practice is really important conversations to have. And to be engaged in about that, going back to that reflection and reflective practitioner, what does that really look like in that space? So, having a good mentor and even, experienced teachers having a mentor or a critical friend can be really important, engaging in the curriculum and what does that look like.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, I was thinking, obviously, sort of segueing beautifully to the next question, really, because, I think I remember my early days as a teacher and all the stuff that you learn at university. There are so many other things that you just aren't prepared for, like the school photograph day, and especially if you're a kinder teacher, trying to get all of those children to sit and face the camera first, even things like fire drills, all those external pressures that you don't think about until you're in the job, and what you think is what's going to be your core job, all those external things. And I suppose, do we set some of our graduates up understanding some of those external pressures and how they deal with that? Because I think we go in, we're teachers and we've got our certificate and we're all set to go. What advice would you give to graduates who are just about to start that first year of teaching?
I think the mantra of being kind to yourself is really important, and getting that life-work balance, I think, is really critical in that space, and that aids the lack of burnout for teachers, because I think, they just haven't got the life-work balance curated well enough. And really finding that mentor, I think, is really critical in having that learning opportunity to articulate what does good practice look like and what does best practice look like, and how do I engage in that, and how do I have those conversations so I am that reflective practitioner, I think, is really important. So being kind to yourself, finding a really good mentor to have, and give yourself time to work into the rhythm and flow of the day of a classroom, and really building responsive relationships with children and families is critical, especially in those first few years, because you are the expert in the learning environment, but the parent is the expert in the child. So how do you bring those two together and have those collaborative conversations is really important, to have that culturally responsive curriculum, but also a culturally responsive environment for the child and for the parent, I think, is really pivotal. So I would be establishing those really clearly in the first few years of practice.
Yeah, that's I suppose, even just thinking about that now, that even the emotional element of that, where a child goes to school, for as a parent, a lot of emotions involved, dropping the first day, that sense of you've now entered into something more formalized. And as a teacher, I guess, you're absorbing a lot of that on top of working in a classroom. You were also really managing, parents who 100% they've given you the most precious thing in the world to look after. And that comes with experience, but also it takes someone, I always think early years teachers are brilliant because they have those nuances. They understand that. They understand, when to peel off, when to let go, get all that sort of subtlety. So yeah, that's absolutely lovely. And I think what you were saying about burnout is really, really true. I think it frustrates everyone, isn't it, when people in the profession look at it from a point of view of contact hours, how much time you spend with children versus actually the whole picture. And we do get stuck as educators in that 10-week cycle of the get to 10 weeks, recover for a week, then start to enjoy, and then be back in that framework. So that is, I think, something that probably, as you said, that lovely be kind to yourself and find the rhythm. Yeah, is a brilliant, lovely thing. Thank you for that. Now, I suppose that this has been a bit of a tricky question, because sometimes it's more not maybe about who in the education world is sort of moving and shaking, but also what do you think conceptually, or things that are happening that you think, oh, this is really exciting, and this is going to be a great future 2025 plus, where there's going to be something that's going to maybe change and help support education?
I'm sort of influenced by the work of the University of Melbourne here in Victoria, and Professor John Quay's work. He's developed a framework combining understanding by design and really having students at the heart of the framework, and looking at how do we engage with the curriculum in that way, and what activities do you want the student to develop student agency in that space. So really looking at the outcomes of the unit of work as a learning outcome, and creating what he calls performance products, that the child is really clear about the success criteria, and saying, this is what success looks like for me with the learning outcomes, and this is how I'm engaging with the achievement standards and the content descriptors. So he's developed a living framework that he's been rolling out in schools here in Victoria. And we're seeing quite a shift in the way teachers augment their unit planning work, and how they engage in those artefacts with the students, and how that's impacted moderation, and how that's developed a collaborative collective for the process of the teachers, and a really positive outcome, so that the student is really engaging with an embedded performance product, but also developing that collective knowledge of the curriculum. So it's enabling better moderation, and it's enabling more feedback for the students, so they know themselves as a learner in that really critical and creative space, and enabling creativity, which I don't think we often see enough of in the classroom, especially as children move through the year levels. We sort of tend to say, this is the end product, here's your rubric to go with it, but not really allowing that deep level of engagement with the product, and really bringing out that critical and creative thinking side for a shared outcome with the students. So I'm finding that work quite interesting, and the conversations that he's having with staff, and how it's impacting their way of curating those units of work.
Yes, that sounds lovely. And it reminds me of the work I remember doing with the work of Gary Steger, where he talked about, I think he was talking about, the end product is you're going to make a beautiful bee art project, you're going to make this 3D project of a bee. And as opposed to saying, have a go at making a bee first, and then you're invested because you want to do it, we sort of do this whole dangling the carrot. You've got to learn about this, you've got to learn about that, and we've lost so many children in that process. So when they actually go to make the bee, it's like, there's so much information that I haven't got that creativity, because I didn't get that start, that really key part. So I think that's wonderful. And I remember I used to try and put into my own workshops, when I was, doing professional learning, giving people a task and saying, you've got 5 minutes to complete it, and then stopping them after 3 and saying, how do you feel? And in the majority of cases, there was rage, there was anger, and it was, but you told me I had longer, like, I haven't finished. And I think we get caught up in that in education. Oh, next lesson, let's go. And we don't give children that beauty of time and the element of, this is what it is. So that work sounds really inspirational. We'd lovely we'll drop some links in the comments about how people can follow along with that. So I've kind of got to the last question, which I always love, because it really touches, I think, it sort of gives us a chance to really think about our own journey and where we've come from, quite an emotional way. But who was your favourite teacher at school, and can you tell us a little bit about them?
I'd probably have to say Mrs. McNabb when I went to Penley Lesson and Grammar. She was an amazing teacher, and when I got to Penley from my local state school, I was 2 years behind their standard when they did the assessments on me. So which was really hard to behind the 8 ball. But she saw potential in me and took me aside and gave me extracurricular work activities to be engaged with, and really enabled me to see my potential and worth, and really inspired me to say, I can do this, and I am a good learner and can be engaged in the learning artefacts in that space. So for me, it was Mrs. McNabb. And when she found out that I did my master's and then I went on to do my doctorate, she was just blown away that, you know, this tiny little thing from Brunswick can suddenly do great things and have potential. So for me, it was Mrs. McNabb. Yep.
Oh, fantastic. And you're so lovely that you've even that she's still part of your life, even to go back and know about your doctorate and all those things.
Yep.
It just shows that, you know, our impact is it's such a long thing. And, you know, even it's not just as we leave that classroom, it just stays with us for so much longer. It's beautiful. Well, Helen, that's gone really quickly, and it's been the most beautiful conversation. And I can only say it was just so lovely to deep dive back into those early years. You know, I think they are so vitally important, and, you know, really setting our students up for success from the very first day. And I actually even like to go back to about the womb. You know, even those days, like, how do we start before they even come into our classroom? What are we providing that safe environment for our children to come into? It's really important. Just to our listeners, if you have been excited about what Helen's been talking about, obviously we've talked a little bit about some of the work that she's being inspired for. We will drop those links into the comments, and similarly, details of her pedagogical pathways programs will all be there, so you can reach out to Helen or ourselves for more information. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to Helen and I today. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.